على من لا نبي بعد نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اقتفى أثره واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. ما بعد, inshallah we'll continue with reading from the book known as the Musannaf of Abu Bakr Abdullah bin Muhammad ibn Abi Shayba rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 235 after the Hijrah. And we are in the section of the author's book that deals with purification, and we've reached the chapter في الرجل يتوضأ فيطأ على العذرة. This chapter is regarding a person who makes wudu and then steps on feces. They step on some waste matter, some fecal matter, i.e. from a human, or of najis nature. And this chapter is basically the foundation for if an individual makes wudu and then comes into contact with something that is najis. Right? He steps in, he touches, he comes into contact with something that is najis. Is it necessary for him to make a wudu? Is it necessary for him to wash it off, to wash the location? What is the obligation if one has purification or one has purity and then comes into contact with something najis? What do they have to do? And so Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا حفص بن غياث عن الأعمش عن يحيى بن Withab. Yahya ibn Withab. Let's see. Yahya ibn Withab. Wathab with a shadda. On Yahya ibn Wathab with the tashdid. مثلثة الأسدي مولاهم الكوفي المقري ثقة عابد من الرابعة مات سنة 300. يحيى ابن وثاب with a shadda. He says that حدثنا حفص بن غياث عن الأعمش عن يحيى بن وثاب قال سئل ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما عن رجل خرج إلى الصلاة فوطأ على عذرة قال إن كانت رطبة غسل ما أصابه وإن كانت يابسة لم تضره. Abu Bakr, he says that Hafs ibn Ghiyath, he narrated to us on the authority of Al-A'mash, on the authority of Yahya ibn Wathab, who said that Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu or anhuma was asked about a man who leaves to go to salah, and on his way he steps in some feces. Ibn Abbas, he said, in kanat ratiba, if the feces was wet, if it was moist, if it was, wet in nature, then he needs to wash off that which contaminated him. When kanat yabisa lam tadurra, but if it was dry, then it doesn't harm him, that he stepped in such a thing. And so this is the statement of Ibn Abbas, that if a person steps in feces that is wet, fresh, then an individual needs to wash off what contaminated him, what affected him from such. But if it was dry, then it doesn't cause him any harm and he can keep going. He doesn't need to wash it off. And the question is, what is the difference? Why did he differentiate? Is dry feces tahir, so that it doesn't need to be washed off? Why would he differentiate between the two? And the answer is that because najasa is transmitted through moisture. And this is an important fact or principle regarding the transmission of impurities, that impurities are transmitted through moisture, because moisture is the medium from which permanent najasa is able to cling to a non-najis surface and thus make it temporarily najis. Right? When we talk about najasa, we should know that there are two types of najasa. There is a najasatul ayniyah, right? Permanent najasa, something that it itself is najis. It cannot be cleaned, like the feces itself of humans, for example, or like a pig, right? These are items that no matter what you do to them, they cannot be made pure. And then you have what is known as temporary najasa, right? When a pure surface or a pure substance becomes contaminated momentarily by something that is najis. And so that najis substance, when it contaminates a pure surface, that pure surface can be washed and that najasa can be removed to get that pure surface or that pure substance back to its original state. And so that's what we call temporary najasa. So like, for example, if a dog licks into somebody's container, that container is temporarily najis. It can be washed and made pure again, right? If somebody urinates on a surface, that surface can be washed and that najasa can be removed and that surface can become tahir or pure again. And so when we understand the nature of najasa, permanent and temporary, we understand that it is moisture that allows a pure surface or substance to become contaminated and allows the najasa to cling to it. And so for this reason, you often find the scholars talking about that there needs to be some moisture transfer of the najasa for the surface to become contaminated. As far as if the najasa is dry, it's a solid substance that is dry in nature, that has no moisture, then it doesn't contaminate that which it comes into contact with, because there's no medium for it to transfer and transmit. And so, for example, you find like the Hanabila, who deem that the bags and the satchels made out of tanned animal hide that was not slaughtered properly, they say that it is najis. This is the statement of the Hanabila. But in spite of that, they say that it's permissible to carry dry substances, because even though that bag is najis to them, they feel that there's no moisture for the najasa to transmit over to dry substances. Likewise, for example, when we talk about a dog, petting a dog, if you say that the dog is najis and the hair of the dog and the fur of the dog is najis, then you find that in spite of that, people didn't used to deem it to be najis to pet a dog or if a dog rubbed up against them, because there was no medium for transmitting the najasa if the fur was dry. And so this is the reason that Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhum is separating between moist feces and between that which is dry. So he says that if it in kanat ratiba, if it was that which was moist, then it needs to be washed off, because that will allow it to cling to the surface and transmit and temporarily cause the surface or the substance to become najis. Whereas if it was dry and somebody stepped on it, then it would just crumble and fall off, and it would not stain or cling or adhere to the surface that came in contact with it. And so this is the reason why Ibn Abbas is differentiating between the two. And it is not because there's a difference in the purity or najasa of the substance of feces, right? Whether it's dry or najis or wet, it's still najasatun ayniyah. But najasatun ayniyah doesn't transfer except via rutuba, except via moisture. Now, he says, حدثنا هشيم عن مغيرة عن إبراهيم أنه قال في الرجل يطأ على العذرة وهو طاهر قال إن كان رطبا غسل ما أصابه وإن كان يابسا فلا شيء عليه. Abu Bakr, he says that Hushaym narrated to us on the authority of Mughira, on the authority of Ibrahim, yani Ibrahim al-Nakhai, regarding a man who steps on feces while he is in a state of purity, right? He has wudu, he's clean, his clothes are clean, his body's clean. Ibrahim, he said about this individual, in kana ratiba, if the feces was wet, was moist, then he needs to wash off that which contaminated him. وإن كان يابسا فلا شيء عليه. But if it was dry, then he doesn't need to do anything. لا شيء عليه. There's nothing he needs to do. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا يحيى بن سعيد القطان عن ابن جريج عن عطاء أنه قال إن كان رطبا غسله وإن كان يابسا فلا يضره. Abu Bakr, he says that Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, he narrated to us on the authority of Ibn Jurayj, on the authority of Ata, who said that if it was moist, then he needs to wash it. And if it was dry, then it doesn't cause him any harm. It doesn't harm him at all. It's no problem. Abu Bakr, he says, حدثنا يزيد بن هارون عن التيمي عن الحسن رضي الله قال في الرجل يطأ على العذرة الرطبة قال يغسله ولا يتوضأ. Abu Bakr, he says, Yazid ibn Harun, he narrated to us on the authority of At-Taymi, on the authority of Al-Hasan, yani Hasan al-Basri, regarding a man who steps in feces that is wet, right? Moist feces. Hasan al-Basri, he says he needs to wash it, but he does not need to make wudu. And that's the point here, that an individual does not need to perform a wudu from coming into contact with najis surfaces or najis substances. Najasa is something that is different than hadath, right? Najasa is an impurity that is different than hadath. And when we talked about purification, we said that at-tahara huwa raf'ul hadath wa izalatu or zawalun najas, right? Purification is to remove the hadath and to get rid of the najasa. And so we have to understand that najasa is something different than hadath. Yes, najasa needs to be removed from the body, the clothing, and the location that an individual is going to pray at before they can pray. But it does not invalidate a person's religious purity. When we talk about hadath being that quality that prevents an individual, a quality or an action that occurs in the body that prevents an individual from being able to pray or things similar. So coming in contact with najasa or eating najasa for that matter, right? If an individual mistakenly eats some pork or drinks some alcohol, do those things nullify their wudu? And the stronger view is that they do not, right? Let alone if somebody touches or steps in or comes into contact with najasa, then it does not nullify one's purification and it is not considered a hadath. نعم. Abu Bakr, he says حدثنا وكيع عن إسرائيل عن جابر عن عامر في من وطأ على جيفة أو حيضة أو عذرة يابسة فلا بأس. Abu Bakr, he says that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Israel, on the authority of Jabir, on the authority of Amir, regarding one who steps in Karen, Jifa. Karen or Jifa is the carcass of an animal that hasn't been slaughtered, right? There's a dead animal on the road, right? We see it roadkill nowadays on our highways, right? Or on our streets. If there's a dead animal that hasn't been slaughtered and it's rotting and it's decaying, they call that Jifa in Arabic. So if an individual steps on Jifa or Hayda, if an individual steps in period blood, right? A woman who was on her period had a garment or a tampon nowadays or a maxi pad, and it was thrown in a bathroom, and an individual walks into the bathroom and there's a maxi pad on the ground and he steps on it, right? This is najis. If an individual steps on Karen or a carcass, a rotting carcass, or if he steps in period blood, or if he steps in feces, right? He steps in a pile of dog feces or human feces. Then if it is dry, it does not cause him any harm. This is the statement of Amr Shabi. Naam. The next narration, he says, حدثنا وكيع and Muhammad ibn Talha and Zubayr عن سعيد ibn Jubair أنه قال لا بأس بطين يخالطه البول. Now this is another scenario. He says that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Muhammad ibn Talha, on the authority of Zubayr, on the authority of Sa'id ibn Jubair, who said there's no harm from mud mixed with urine. Right? There's no harm if there is mud that has been mixed with urine. Why is this the case? We know urine is najis and mud is pure. Mud is the occurrence of water and or a liquid and dirt. They come together and they make mud. And more often, mud is made when there is a high concentration of water, right? When it rains and the dirt muddies and becomes clean, right? It's not just wet dirt. It becomes that slosh. That's what is known as mud, clean, right? That thick, sloshy mud. This is what is being referred to. And he is saying, Yani Sa'id ibn Jubair is saying that if somebody urinates when the ground is muddy, does that, because now we have a liquid, does that transmit if somebody steps in that? So it's been raining all day and somebody goes to the side of the building and urinates. And then somebody else walks in that path where there was urine and the ground is muddy. Does that contaminate the individual to where he now needs to wash off that location? Or if his thobe was dragging against the ground or brushed up against the mud, does he need to wash that off now before he can pray? And here, Sa'id ibn Jubair, he says, no, the individual does not need to do so. There's la ba's. There's no harm in mud that is mixed with urine. But why is that the case? I thought we just mentioned that if there's moisture, then the najasa transmits and contaminates. The reason why he is saying there is no harm is because, as we said, mud is the occurrence of water and dirt in abundance. And that urine, when an individual pees into the mud, for example, and that urine dissipates, right? It becomes lesser, it becomes diluted in the amount of water that is in the mud, to where you can no longer see the effects of it. You can no longer see the traces of the urine. So a person doesn't know if that is urine or if it's water, because now the surface, the substance is muddy. And so there's no way to distinguish between the water and the urine of it. And so for this reason, Sa'id ibn Jubair is saying, or Sa'id ibn Jubair is saying that there's no harm. And this should be differentiated between, for example, akramakumullah, if an individual urinates in abundance to where you start to see the foam and the suds rise above the mud, and you can see the urine sitting on top of the mud, for example. Or, for example, if the mud contains the odor of the urine, right? If the mud, you can tell that it contains the odor of the urine, or, akramakumullah, if it was mud that was only made from urine. Like, for example, somebody cleans out their septic tank, right? Because I know somebody might say, well, how could there be mud only from urine? People don't urinate in that abundance. But let's say, for example, somebody cleans out their septic tank, and their septic tank is filled of liquid feces and urine, and that when they're cleaning it out, it's draining into a field, right? They have the tank that's cleaning it out and it's sucking out the feces, but it has a leak or there's spillage that's draining into a field. And so that field becomes muddy because of that feces, because of that urine. Then here, one might be inclined to say that no, this mud is najis because its existence is based off of najasa or liquid najasa, as opposed to if there was mud that occurred naturally through rain and then somebody urinates in it, where the urine dissipates and dissolves into the mud to where you can no longer see the traces. And so this is what, and Allah knows best, the statement of Sa'id ibn Jubair should be taken as. If there is mud that is mixed with urine, not mud that is made from urine, or not urine that is sitting on top of mud, but mud that has some urine in it. And this is a principle that is universal to all substances and surfaces. Al-hukm yaduru ma'illatihi wujudan wa adama. The ruling revolves around the reason for it in its presence as well as in its absence. When it comes to najasa, this principle, the ruling that is given to something, is based upon the justice or the reason behind the ruling to confirm its presence or to establish its absence. So when we talk about najasa, if the essence and the ruling of the najasa is there, if the substance is visible and noticeable and present, then we say that this surface or this substance has become najis because of the presence of najasa. But if that presence of najasa disappears for any reason, if that presence of najasa goes away, then the surface must be ruled that it is pure, even if it came into contact with najasa, because the surface has no traces of it. It doesn't carry its smell, its odor, its taste. And so therefore, the surface or the substance must be ruled as pure. And so this is what Sa'id ibn Jubair is referencing when he says mud mixed with urine. The urine has dissipated and disappeared and dissolved into the mud until there's no trace of it left. And so you can't smell it, you don't see it, right? It doesn't carry its taste. Then in this circumstance, there's no harm, even though we know that there was urine there. So somebody who is walking in a muddy field, they shouldn't allow waswasa to overtake them and say, oh, you know what? Maybe somebody urinated in this field and maybe has urine in the mud and the mud got on my shoes, or the mud got on the bottom of my thobe, or maybe I splashed into a puddle and some of it got on my toes. And so this must be najis. We say no, right? Da'an kal waswasa. Remove from yourself this whispering and this compulsion, and know that if it's mud mixed with water, then there's la bas. There's no harm. Now, Ibn Abi Shayba, he says, Hadathana Ubaidah ibn Humayd. And I'm pretty sure it's Ubaidah. I think everybody is Ubaidah except Abida ibn Salman. Abida to Salmani. But here it says Abida ibn Humayd. Abida ibn Humayd. Let's see. Does he mention it? What it's Abida ibn Humayd al-Kufi Abu Abdul Rahman al-Ma'ruf bil-Hadha تيمي أو الليثي أو الضبي صدوق نحوي ربما أخطأ من الثامنة مات سنة 90 وقد جاوز 80. So Abida. And that might just be from the Tabi'een that I'm thinking about. Abida ibn Humayd. Abu Bakr, he says, مات كم؟ سنة 90. يعني سنة 190. He died in the year 190. صدوق ربما أخطأ. He says, حدثنا عبيدة بن حميد عن سنان ابن حبيب عن أبي معشر عن إبراهيم في الرجل يطأ على العذرة أو على العذرة وهو يريد المسجد. قال إبراهيم لا يعيد الوضوء. Here he says that Abidah ibn Humayd narrated to us on the authority of Sinan ibn Habib, on the authority of Abi Ma'shar, on the authority of Ibrahim, yani Ibrahim al-Nakhai, regarding a man who steps in feces on his way to the masjid, and while he's going to the masjid. Ibrahim, he said, he should not repeat the wudu. This individual does not need to repeat the wudu. And this narration, as well as the first narration that was mentioned on Ibn Abbas, it has a benefit in it. And this is the benefit, because a lot of times, sometimes a person might look at a narration, and because of the norms of their society, they don't necessarily notice the benefit. Nowadays, when we go into the masajid, we go in the masajid with our shoes off. We don't leave our shoes on and walk into the masjid and pray in our shoes. Although this was something that was the sunnah and normal for people of the past. Their masjids weren't carpeted often. And so they would pray in their shoes. And the Prophet ﷺ encouraged the people to pray in their shoes. And so if we're praying in our shoes and we're going to the masjid wanting to make salat, and then we step into some feces, yes, we know we do not have to make wudu like this narration of Ibrahim and Nakhai says. But now there could potentially be feces on the bottom of our shoes. Should we track this into the masjid, or do we need to wash our shoes off? And if we have to wash our shoes off, is this something that is a difficulty or something that is, tolerable and easy enough? And so when we look, we see that here is why the Salaf would talk about this issue with the detail and the categorization that they mentioned. If it was wet, then wash it off, because you're going to go into the masjid, you're going to go into someone's home, and that wet feces would stick to your shoe, and you would carry it with you and contaminate other locations, especially the masjid. While if it was dry feces, then if you stepped in it, it would crumble. And even if something might have clung, for example, into the grooves and the treads of your shoes, then this is something that the ground that you walk on after it would clean it off. As opposed to the wet feces, the ground that you walked on after it would simply smear it and rub it around. But if it was dry, then it would clear it off and remove it. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Yutahiruhu ma ba'da." When one of his wives asked regarding that if they have a train or a long tail on their dress that might pass through najis surfaces, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, it cleans it what comes after it. I.e., when it passes through the najis surface, then the ground that it rubs on after it, that dries it off and dusts it up and removes the najasa from it. And likewise, he said, when one of you comes to the masjid and he has filth on his shoes, then let him scrape them on the ground before entering the masjid, because that will purify them. And so this is why they might talk about this issue with such detail and talk about the difference between needing to wash it or not needing to wash it if the feces or the najasa substance is that which is dry. Now, so that's this section regarding a man who steps in some filth or some adira, some feces. What does he need to do, right? After he's regarding a man who has made wudu, and then he steps into some feces. Inshallah, the next chapter, which we'll take next time, regarding a man who yata'ul mawdi' al-qadr, yata' ba'dahu ma huwa anzaf. If a person steps into a place, if a person steps on a surface that is filled of filth, a filthy surface, and then he steps on a place after that that is purer than it, right? And that's basically the narrations that we just mentioned. If you step into filth and then rub it on ground after that, how that purifies the location. And that's something that there's disagreement about, because some scholars say that only water can purify najasa. But those who hold this opinion that stepping on clean earth and rubbing it on clean earth cleans it, then this is a proof that, as the Prophet said, "Ju'ilat liya al-ardu masjidan wa tahura." The earth has been made for me a place to pray and a medium for purification, or a means for purification. And so the ground actually removes the najasa. And it goes back to the principle that we made, or that we mentioned, that najasa is ruled if its essence or its item is present. So if the actual substance is removed, then it is no longer possible to qualify the surface as najis, even if najasa came into contact with it previously. But as I said, we'll talk about that when we get into the next chapter. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. نعم. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. What about the splash of the toilet seat? This is an important one. This is an important one, right? And this is something like jazakumullahu khair on this type of question, because this is an important thing that we all suffer from. Especially here in the West, our toilets are built in a way that one might say is contrary to the sunnah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he forbade us from urinating in stagnant water. He forbade us from urinating in stagnant water. Likewise, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam kana yatabawwa li bawlihi mawdi'a, right? Kama yatabawwa ahadakum li manzili. Or kama qal, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he used to select for his urine a place the same way that one of you might select and be choosy about the place that he's going to live. And that's to avoid getting splashed back on and to have the filth contaminate him. But in our toilet structures nowadays, we notice that, one, they're made out of a hard porcelain, which is conductive to splashback. Two, more often than not, we're urinating and defecating in water, which is conducive to splashing. And when we talk about splashing, that water and that filth that might splash back and contaminate our bottoms, contaminate our scrotum, contaminate our cheeks, contaminate our labia, right, for the women, then here it's very important, because the madhahib, the opinions that a large amount of the scholars adopt, is that if the contamination exceeds the location of exit, the exit point, right? If you're urinating and the urine gets on somewhere other than where it came out of, it gets somewhere other than the hole, or if you're defecating and it gets somewhere other than the anus, the crack, then it is not sufficient to do istijmar. It is not sufficient to wipe that location. And that location has to be washed. And yes, this goes in accordance to the position that only water can remove that substance. And even if we say that, other things can remove najasa, when we really look at the issue, akramakumullah, and those of us who use the toilet, we notice these things, but might have never paid attention to it. You might find, for a man, for example, the bottom of his scrotum might have moisture on it, right? What they call the taint, the area between the anus and the scrotum, or sometimes even between the shaft and the scrotum, it might have moisture from the toilet on it, where this water splashed back and contaminated him. Likewise, for men and women, if they have an explosive bowel movement, it might splash in the water. Or if it's moist in nature and diuretic or diarrhea in nature, it might excrete from them in a way that contaminates more than the surface area of where it came from, i.e., more than the hole from which it exited. And even if you wipe this surface with tissue, right, if you dry the scrotum or you wipe the cheeks or the inner thigh where the water or the filth has splashed onto with tissue, you'll find that there's still a trace of this najasa. And so it's important to realize that because of our circumstances, especially here in the West, that we urinate and defecate into bowls made out of porcelain, a hard substance that allows it to splash back, especially if, toilets are of different sizes. This is something that, some people might not be aware of. They're different size toilet bowls. Somebody might have, I know, for example, akramakumullah, our contractor, when they put our bathroom in upstairs, they purchased originally a small toilet bowl, and that's problematic, especially if a person is of a larger size. And so you have to be conscious of these things, that splashback, it might not be sufficient enough to just wipe it off. And this is, the application of what the Prophet ﷺ, when he mentioned that the two individuals who were getting punished, and they were getting punished for something that wasn't that big. Instead, he said, no, it is that big. As far as one of them, فَكَانَ لَا يَسْتَنْزِهُ or لَا يَسْتَتِرُ. He used to not keep away or protect himself from urine from getting on him. And so when we use the toilet in these fashions where it's porcelain, and it might be a small bowl, and it might be full of water that we're urinating and defecating in, that all of these things cause a large splashback potential. And then we find moisture on our thigh or on our, undercarriage, if you will, right? Our private area, our pubic area. Then we need to pay attention that surface might need to be cleaned off with water, and it is not sufficient potentially to just wipe it with tissue, right? And this is something that is from the hygiene of the Muslim, and especially because tissue might not remove all of the traces of the filth. And istinja, according to a large group of scholars, is only a replacement for istijmar, or wiping, is only a replacement for washing. And so that is why that when wiping, there could still be traces left that are excused because you've wiped the best that you could. But those traces that are left are only excusable at the point of exit, i.e. the anus hole or the urine hole. Those are where it's excused to have traces left that wiping can't get rid of. But as far as anywhere else, like if it got on your thigh or your cheeks or your scrotum, then this is something that needs to be washed off. And so when it comes about the splashing of the toilet seat, right, sitting on the toilet, these are some of the things that we have to be conscious of, especially here in the West. And this is where Islamic education meets secular expertise, right? There should be from amongst us Muslims who are coming up with ideas, Muslim plumbers, Muslim engineers who are coming up with ideas to make, if we're going to utilize indoor plumbing, coming up with ideas to reduce the harms of the current indoor plumbing system, right? What kind of materials could be used to reduce the splashing? What kind of methods could be used to reduce the sewer gas from getting back out of the pipe other than water? What kind of seals could be used other than water so we could avoid disobeying the Prophet by urinating in still water, right? What other ways of disposal could we use, right? When we're building a house or we're designing a home, making sure that the toilet isn't facing the Qibla. All of these things, Muslim plumbers and engineers, we're relying on them to advance this field and to not just be sufficed with that system that the kuffar have brought about with their ingenuity, right? Yes, we all benefit from indoor plumbing. None of us, I believe, feels like going to the outhouse or to the outsides of town or digging a hole in the ground and using the toilet, right? We all When we buy a home, the first thing we look at is, oh, look at the ensuite. Look at how nice the bathroom is that is attached to the bedroom. We don't even want to leave our bedrooms when it comes time to use the toilet. That being the case, we need to have advancements in this field so that we can establish the religion even in these topics. And this is when the Muslims were at their best and were excellent, when they took the religion and they used the religion to improve their day-to-day life. But that's what has to do with, the splashback from the toilet. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. What about taking the baby stroller or wheelchair into the musalla? A similar concept, right? If the wheels rolled over something that is najis, that was moist, and that najasa is sticking to them, then you should wash them off. But if they rolled over something that was najis and was dry, then inshallah it doesn't harm it. And in any circumstance, we use that same principle. Because a person might say, well, I pushed the baby carriage around the whole city. I don't know. I'm wheelchairing all day long. I don't know if it hit something. Then we look. Do you see najasa on any of the wheels? If the answer is no, then the surface is clean. And if you see najasa on the wheels, then that area is now najis, because the ruling follows the reason in its existence and in its absence. And this is an important point, right? The Muslims were not extra sensitive to some of the things that the kuffar might find themselves extra sensitive to, right? We have purity as part of our religion, but it doesn't take us to extremes to where we're extra sensitive about everything. I'm not worried about somebody rolling in the masjid with their wheelchair that I don't want to make sujood on the spot where their wheelchair touched because maybe there was some najasa on it, right? Somebody who was in their home or in a clean bathroom and might have walked into their bathroom at home or a clean bathroom or the wudu area, for example, in the masjid with no slippers on. I'm not overly sensitive when they walk back in the masjid because that location that they walked on was pure. A person walks around outside barefooted, which is the sunnah, right? To walk around barefooted from time to time. And then they walk into the masjid. I'm not worried about, oh, well, now I need to make sujood where they walked and maybe that place is najis. We're not oversensitive like that. If we see najasa, we clean it. And if we don't see it, we treat it as if it's not there. But at the same point in time, there's the responsibility of the individual to be conscious about themselves, right? So to try to reduce the things that could cause harm or cause aversion. When you cough and sneeze, cover your mouth. Don't let your cough and sneeze go all onto the carpet, right? It doesn't make the carpet najis, and it doesn't guarantee that an individual will become contaminated and sick because you did that. La adwa fil Islam, right? There's no contagion in Islam. But at the same point in time, that's going to cause aversion. And that's going to cause a difficulty in the chest of the Muslim who's praying next to you. And indeed, the angels are annoyed and offended by the same thing that offends Bani Adam. Likewise, hygiene, right? Clean your feet. We want people to stand foot to foot, shoulder to shoulder. That comes with making sure you wash your feet, clean your feet, wear deodorant, have nice clothes. Don't come to the masjid, right after eating that smelly lunch of garlic and onion. We notice sometimes from our brothers, they might have had a great lunch of curry and onion, and mashallah, they've been cooking all day, and then they rush out to the masjid and their clothes reek of the smells. These are things that offend the people that are praying, even if they're not najis. And the Prophet ﷺ, he used to forbid people who have eaten from garlic or onion from entering into the masjid. And he used to kick them out to Baqi'. In Umar, he said, kill off that smell by cooking it, so that you reduce the odor of it, right? I know that a lot of times, like in our masajid, we used to have a kitchen for the people who might be living or staying in the masjid, and somebody cooks fish in the masjid's kitchen. This causes a smell and an odor that you have to be conscious of, even if it's not najis. So even though we're not hypersensitive right? For example, we wash our hands after we eat, not necessarily before. Even though we're not hypersensitive as it relates to najasa and germs and things like this, the individual has a responsibility on themselves to not do something that causes harm or annoyance or aversion to the people that he comes in contact with. So as far as the wheelchair or the baby stroller, then this is some of that. The same thing. If najasa gets on clothes, the same thing. If it's wet and it stains, then it needs to be washed. But if it's dry, like somebody like you were driving by, you were riding a bicycle with your friend, for example, and he rode through some dry dung and it flung it back on your clothes, right? And then you wiped it off, right? There's nothing there. والله تعالى أعلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.